Chapter 3 U.S. Conditional Surrender Grant. On February 10, 1861, Jefferson Davis, late of the United States Senate, had been pruning rose bushes in the garden of Briar Field, his expansive cotton plantation on the Mississippi River just south of Vicksburg, the city that would eventually become the flashpoint of the Southern Confederacy. When at about noon, a horseman from the telegraph depot arrived with an urgent wire. As Davis read the message, a look of anguish crossed his face, which made his wife, Verena, fear that someone in the family had died. The news was, if anything, more shocking. A convention of the recently seceded Southern states had elected Davis president of the new Confederacy. He reacted, said Mrs. Davis, as a man might speak of a sentence of death. Only weeks earlier, Davis, 53 years old, had resigned from the Senate to take command of the Mississippi State Militia, which he hoped eventually would lead to a higher position within the fledgling Confederate Army. But this office, the presidency, the most excruciating political challenge of the times, was a thing he neither aspired to nor desired. Like most of the wealthy planters in Mississippi, Davis had strained and pleaded from his chair in the Senate for some compromise to avert the appalling specter of secession, which he feared would bring a long and bloody war. Ultimately, the voices of moderation were drowned out by a cacophony of Southern lawyers, politicians, and other hotheads aggrieved by decades of Yankee abolitionist abuse, fanned by a hostile Northern press and antagonized by an equally hostile Southern one. Whereas Abraham Lincoln would shortly assume office within an entire government in place and an established army and navy to back it up, the new Confederate president would have none of these when he took the oath of office. It was a trial almost too overwhelming to contemplate, and yet Davis's antique sense of duty overrode his personal misgivings. Next day, after packing a few things, he bade goodbye to Verena and their children and boarded the small weekly paddle wheeler when it stopped at Davis Bend for the trip upriver to Vicksburg. From there, the railroad would carry him into the bloodiest crisis in American history. On that same morning, Lincoln said his goodbyes to his neighbors in Springfield, Illinois, and got on the presidential train heading for his inauguration in Washington. Neither man could know what the future would bring, only that it would likely be calamitous. One of Davis's slaves who had rowed his master out to the steamboat was Ben Montgomery, who would wind up owning Briarfield Plantation after the war. He would say later, Jeff Davis was a man you just couldn't tell what he was thinking. As the war began to crank up in earnest, Washington seemed confused as to how to proceed, while the rebels in Richmond were more sanguine. Yet, even if the South believed it was winning, it was also becoming apparent that its problems were as menacing and immense as the land itself. By mid 1861, a Confederate defensive line had been established all across the South, starting in eastern Virginia at the Atlantic Ocean and stretching southwestward through Kentucky, across the Mississippi River, and through Arkansas into Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, then down to Texas and New Mexico too, where it finally ended in eastern Arizona, as a desert stream in a trickle in dry sand. With more than 2,000 miles to protect along those borders, not to mention far larger stretches in the rear, along the coast where federal ships could blockade cities or land troops, and at this early stage, with no more than 150,000 men in gray uniforms, the problem that loomed must have seemed endless. It was as though no one beforehand had considered the true military implications of secession, which in truth they had not. At this early point in the war, despite the fighting at Bull Run and the beginnings of the naval blockade, as well as federal military buildups in the Shenandoah and all along the southern boundaries, many Southerners, including those in high political places, still hoped that full-scale war was not imminent, that somehow the North would see the error of its ways and let the South go in peace. With Abraham Lincoln in the White House, that was, of course, a pipe dream. The simple fact was that the only way the South could win was in the way almost all insurrections are won, if there are one at all, to make the other side pay so dearly in lives, treasure, and energy that it finally gets tired and gives in. Neither the North nor the South fully understood this at the time. One man who came closer to understanding this than most was Jefferson Davis. For reasons both political and military, it was his strategic policy that the Confederacy would defend itself at all points, contesting every inch of Southern soil from encroachment by Union forces. At his first inaugural in Montgomery, Alabama, he had flung down the defiant gauntlet with the declaration, "All we ask is to be let alone," and by that he meant everywhere. The politics involvement were both parochial and international. Davis believed that the citizens of the Confederacy would become alarmed and liable to defect as portions of their states were allowed to be overrun by the enemy, even if the reason for it was to concentrate large Southern armies elsewhere to deal a fatal blow at some future date. Internationally, the Confederate leaders clung to hopes that Great Britain and France would give their new nation diplomatic recognition, and further that they would intervene in the war with their powers' navies to lift the southern blockade of southern ports, which had thrown nearly half the European textile mill employees out of work, as well as severely hampering the importation of Confederate military supplies. These powerful countries saw that the Union armies were being turned back wherever they were met. Davis reasoned help would surely flow from the quarter. At that point, the Confederacy was organized into two large departments, that of Virginia in the east, under Joseph E. Johnston and across the Appalachian Mountains, the Department of the West, under command of Albert Sidney Johnston, whose responsibility encompassed an area of more than 1,000,000 square miles. Holding it together, or trying to, was the dynamic, rigid personality of Jefferson Davis, cotton planter, intellectual, West Point graduate, hero of the Mexican War, former U.S. Senator, and one-time Secretary of War. So far, Davis and his generals had done an adequate job, but as they prepared to enter the second year of war, cracks began to appear in the scams. Jefferson Davis was born in a Kentucky log house in 1808, not far from the place where Abraham Lincoln was born. As the youngest of 10 children, his father, Samuel, 52, and mother, Jane, 47, gave him the middle name Phineas, in part to signify that they'd had enough childbearing for one generation. Samuel, a hero of the Revolutionary War, had migrated from Georgia to Kentucky in the mid-1790s, where he had set up a sizable tobacco and cotton plantation. But Samuel soon got the migration fever again, this time moving into the deep south along the Mississippi, where the land was richer and the cotton growing season longer. He settled the family at the little town of Woodville, right below Natchez, and began building a Mississippi planter's, or Creole, cottage, whose gardens soon produced an abundance of fruit, vegetables, and most particularly roses, which had become so much Jane's specialty that the place was named Rosemount. Accounts of Jefferson's childhood seem idyllic, but owing to the lack of suitable education in Woodville, Samuel shipped him off to a private school in Kentucky at the tender age of 8, to be ministered to by a clutch of Dominican monks. At St. Thomas, Jefferson got an earful of Latin, Greek, and other classical studies and remained there until he was 10, when he was brought home to attend a newly organized local academy with a full curriculum of mathematics, composition, history, and literature. Once, when he refused to do his lessons and walked away from school, little Jeff was given an instructive lesson by his father, who, instead of whipping him, said this: "It is for you to elect whether you will work with head or hands." Then gave him a sack and sent him to the fields along with his slaves to pick cotton all day and see how he liked it. He didn't, and there was no more talk of quitting school. When Davis was 15 in 1823, he was sent off to Transylvania College in Lexington, Kentucky, where he became a first-rate scholar and honor student described by one of his classmates as the most active, intelligent, and splendid-looking young man in the college. Meantime, Jefferson's father went bankrupt, owing to a large debt he had agreed to secure for one of his son-in-laws, lost Rosemont, and had to move with his slaves to the large plantation of his eldest son, Joseph, at Davis Bend, just below Vicksburg. He was not there a week before he died at the age of 67. These developments left the teenage Jefferson with the dilemma of finding a way to afford his senior year of college, and then law school, or accepting an appointment to the United States Military Academy, which had free tuition. With a certain reluctance that was closer to resignation, in 1824 he chose West Point. Davis got off to a bad beginning at the Point by reporting late for admission, and stayed in trouble on and off for his entire 4 years there. Academically, he did not do badly, but his deportment was horrible. Drinking, missing formations, untidiness, and leaving the post without authorization got him arrested or reported a number of times, and once he was court-martialed. His involvement in the infamous eggnog riot of Christmas Day, 1826, nearly had him dismissed, and it was rumored that he once got in a fistfight with fellow cadet Joseph Johnston over a girl at Benny Haven's notorious off-post drinking establishment. Furthermore, along with many other Southern cadets, Davis developed a distinct aversion to Yankees in the cadet corps, as this was about the time the abolitionist fervor in the North was starting to emerge. Still, he had graduated even if in the bottom third of his class, and was commissioned a second lieutenant and sent to the infantry training school at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. From there, he saw service on the Indian frontier and participated, as did Abraham Lincoln, in the Black Hawk War, actually capturing Chief Black Hawk himself and escorting him to his boss, Colonel Zachary Taylor, commander of the U.S. 1st Infantry Regiment. Not only that, but Davis promptly fell in love with Taylor's daughter, Sarah Knoxie Taylor. Despite her father's misgivings, the two were married in 1835. 6 years after, Davis had joined the regular army, serving on the hard frontiers among the Indian tribes. At one point, he contracted what was probably pneumonia, which nearly killed him, and left him sickly for the remainder of his life, a factor that was to weigh heavily during the Civil War years. But with the army now behind him, the newlyweds soon settled in at Davis Bend, at Hurricane, the plantation of his brother Joseph at a time when cotton truly had become king along the Mississippi River. Joseph Davis, who was old enough to be Jefferson's father, and soon behaved as such, had given Jeff some 800 acres and sent his slaves to build him a plantation house of his own, Briarfield, named after the dense thickets of thorny briars that covered the tract. Joseph also lent him money to buy slaves of his own, and other tools and implements needed for the farm, and soon the young couple settled in the tranquil plantation society of the river. 3 months later, their world caved in. The hot months in the deep south were the deadly season for the fevers, though no one knew exactly why. Most suspected miasmas and other noxious odors emanating from the bogs and swamps. Others pointed to something in the water, while yet others blamed the weather itself. In a way, they were all correct, except that it was the lethal parasite carried by the female Anopheles mosquito, which hatches its young in the warm, putrid swamps that proliferate in Delta country. Planters often made a point of taking their families to Appalachian mountain resorts such as the Greenbrier, or even as far away as Maine. But sometime late that summer, both Davis and his wife were bitten, probably on the same day, and possibly by the same mosquito, and both came down with either malaria or yellow fever, yellow jack, as it was known. On September 15th, while Jefferson lay in a coma near death, Knoxie Davis passed away. She was 21 years old. Davis was disconsolate, disconsolate during his long recovery from his illness, but threw himself into learning the work of a planter. By night, he devoured every book he could read from his brother's and later his own library: history, law, poetry, science, literature, politics. His plantation prospered by 1845. He had some 74 slaves working his 800 acres, and the bales of cotton began to pile up at the steamboat wharf at Davis Bend. He became active in the state Democratic politics and helped organize a horse racing track in Vicksburg, as well as an anti-dueling society. Nearer home, he was sometimes looked at. I'm sorry. Nearer home, he was sometimes looked at askance by his neighbors for banning corporal punishment for slaves at Briarfield. Instead, he set up a kind of bondsman's court in which the slaves themselves would hear cases and pass sentence. In his spare time, he cultivated a remarkable variety of roses in his garden, just as his mother had done at Rosemont when he was a boy. Politics seemed to draw Davis more than he was drawn into it, but, like Lincoln, he developed a reputation as a backwoods stump speaker. He was a states' rights Democrat, but certainly no fire eater, and, at the age of 38, he found himself elected to Congress. By then, he had taken a new wife nearly half his age, Farina Howe, daughter of a wealthy naturalist planter, who traveled to Washington for the opening of his first term, only to see him leave his seat 6 months later when the Mexican War broke out. Davis was made a colonel in the Mississippi Volunteers and given a regiment to command under his former father-in-law Zachary Taylor, who had since become the commanding general. The two had eventually reconciled over Knoxie's marriage and death, and Davis earned Taylor's plaudits for distinguished conduct and bravery at the Battle of Monterey. At the Battle of Buena Vista, Davis was seriously wounded in the foot, and again was praised for his gallantry. President James K. Polk offered Davis the commission as a brigadier general of volunteers, but he turned it down to accept an appointment by the governor as the new United States Senator for Mississippi, owing to the death of the incumbent. From the outset, Davis warned in his Senate speeches of the dire consequences likely to result from the sectionalism that seemed to be growing exponentially between North and South. In particular, he cautioned his fellow freshman Senator Simon Cameron, later to be Lincoln's first Secretary of War, that we have drawn near to that which has been for many years my dread, a division marked not by opinions but by geographical lines. Patriotism and only patriotism, Davis asserted, would save the Republic from the evil consequences so likely to follow from a geographical issue. That was in 1846, and the sectionalism, it would seem, had only just begun. Throughout his Senate career, Davis's political philosophy revolved around this theme. As his stature in the Senate grew, particularly in the South, Davis never wavered from the belief that some sort of compromise over the slavery issue was vital to the continuance of the nation, and to that end he labored tirelessly to formulate logical arguments against abolitionists, some of them a stretch even for his usually rational mind. One in particular was that the slaves were happier in their condition than they would have been back in Africa, well fed, clothed, Christianized, and free from the horrors of tribal wars. He must have been thinking, one biographer pointed out, of his own slaves back at Briarfield, whom he had always treated with the utmost care and respect, making a point of saying good morning, bowing to them in return, tending to them if ill, even bringing them presents when he went out of town. He did not seem to appreciate that other owners might not behave in the same fashion. But the single proposition that seems to have run through all of Davis's political and social makeup, ever since his days at the Kentucky school run by monks, was that a logical idea, well presented, can never fail, as well as its risky corollary that he, Davis, could always arrive at the self-same correct logical proposition. This last was a shortcoming that would often burden him, especially when he found himself leader of the Southern Confederacy. As war clouds began to gather over the nation, there was little doubt where Jefferson Davis would stand. Until the last, he argued in the Senate for what he believed could be permanent solutions to the slavery issue. One was an extension of the Missouri Compromise, drawing the line all the way across the country from Missouri to the Pacific, thus maintaining a political equilibrium in the Senate, as new states were added. What he got instead was the Wilmot Proviso, a discordant piece of legislation introduced by a Pennsylvania congressman that would have banned slavery in all territories acquired from Mexico. Although the bill was never passed, it stirred up acrimony on both sides of the ideological spectrum, as though a giant log had been heaved into the political furnace. Davis and other Southerners reasoned that a sort of safety valve had been created by the acquisition of the vast Mexican territory that would balance for the growing political cloud of the abolitionists into the foreseeable future. When this did not occur, sectional feelings were further hardened during the next decade. In 1853, Davis became Secretary of War during the Franklin Pierce presidency, a post at which he excelled, although he developed a considerable reputation as a hands-on administrator whose reluctance to delegate authority often frustrated his underlings. As War Secretary, Davis fought for the so-called Southern Route for a proposed transcontinental railroad to California, arguing logically, he believed, that would be easier, cheaper, and safer than the one currently proposed to begin at Omaha, Nebraska, which would have to cross the treacherous Rocky and Sierra mountain chains, which were often snowbound in winter. He lost the argument, but a sidebar developed that explains in a microcosm how Davis rarely lost an opportunity to prove himself right. When he was still a senator and on the Military Affairs Committee, Davis had recommended that the government purchase a number of camels from the Middle East for the army to use in surveying railroad routes and for peacekeeping duties in the arid terrain of the Southwest. He personally conducted a study of the camel and concluded that the latitudes from whence it came were the same as those in which it would be utilized in America, and thus worked out a formula showing that a single camel could carry 1,000 pounds of freight, versus about a third that for a horse, and the camels needed less than half the water and nutrients horses or mules did. 6 camels would be able to do the work of 12 horses in half the time. His colleagues scoffed and the matter was dropped, but when Davis became Secretary of War, he ordered the project to go forward under his own authority. Accordingly, about 100 of the strange beasts were purchased in Egypt by the U.S. Navy, and on the afternoon of April 29, 1856, a caravan was paraded before the startled citizens of Indianola, Texas, along with their Arab drivers dressed in appropriate garb. This episode demonstrates two things about Davis's personality: that once he decided on something, no matter how large or small, he was tenacious in seeing it through, and second, he invariably took a direct hand in its implementation. These traits, admirable enough in most people, were to cause trouble when, as President of the Confederacy, he often injected himself directly into the military decision making as the war in the West heated up. As the 1850s closed and talk of war became more strident, Davis expressed his horror at the notion of civil war, for among all politicians, North and South, he probably knew better than any what modern armies were capable of. He also knew just how ill prepared the South was to fight. The U.S. Army and Navy, though small, at least had arsenals and ships and a solid organization to build on, as well as a wealth of industry and manpower to draw from. The South had none of these, and would have to start from scratch, a fact that did not seem to occur to the fire eaters, who viewed any disturbance of slavery as a threat to their entire way of life. Davis was a senator again, when, one by one, the Southern states began voting to separate themselves from the Union. So it was when Mississippi went out that Jefferson Davis took his leave from the United States Senate. In his final speech, he apologized to his Northern colleagues for any offenses he might have given to them. "I'm sure I feel no hostility to you senators from the North," he told them, adding, "In this hour of parting, I offer you my apology. Whatever offense there has been to me, I leave here." That having been said, according to his wife, Davis prayed that, before it is too late, peaceful counsels may prevail. Then he left for home in the solitude of Davis Bend, where the fateful message from Montgomery reached him, while he pruned his roses in the garden at Briarfield. 3 months after his raid on the Confederate camp at Belmont, Missouri, Ulysses Grant remained anxious for more action, but Fremont's replacement, Henry Halleck, was just as slow and cautious as the Pathfinder had been. He had under him two armies, Grant's at Cairo and another led by Major General Don Carlos Buell, based in Cincinnati, right across the Ohio River from Kentucky. Buell's army had formerly belonged to Brigadier General William T. Sherman, who had fought admirably but on the losing side at Bull Run, and was then sent west to hold the wavering state of Kentucky in the Union. Sherman hadn't been there long before he was declared insane by the Secretary of War, then by the newspapers, and then again by the army brass, for insisting to the Secretary that it was going to take some 200,000 Union soldiers to put down the rebellion in the upper Mississippi Valley alone, and this at a time where there weren't 200,000 soldiers in the entire Federal Army. Sherman was told to go take a rest, and Buell was put in charge, but Halleck, rightly or wrongly, suspected that Buell was after his own job and kept him on a tight leash. Grant was a different matter entirely, and though Halleck felt he had nothing to fear from the taciturn failed soldier farmer store clerk, he had certainly heard the reports of his drinking habits. It was not overjoyed with Grant's attack at Belmont, once the newspapers decided that it had been a defeat. Thus, Halleck, while he had two substantial armies under his control, was reluctant to use them lest they be beaten, or, in Buell's case, be too successful. And so he fiddled while the Confederates fortified and laid their schemes to retake Kentucky and bring the war back to the banks of the Ohio. Until Grant came along, there wasn't much to speak of in the way of a grand Union strategy in the West. The immenseness of the theater was just as mystifying to the Union generals as it was to the Confederates, and at times the plan seemed to be little more than find the rebels, fight them, and make them run, and capture and hold their cities. This might have worked well enough in a smaller theater such as Virginia, but with all that open territory out west, while the Yankees were busy capturing or holding, say, Nashville, the Confederates might march an army up into Illinois and capture Chicago. Not that they would have, of course, even if they could have, for the Southern strategy at the point was strictly defensive except for those border states, with a large rebel following. The point is that it was going to take a far-seeing Union oracle to conceive and develop a strategic plan to cripple the huge southern regions west of the Appalachians, and as it turned out, that man was Ulysses S. Grant. After Halleck's discourteous reception of his proposal to attack Forts Henry and Donelson, Grant proceeded as if the incident had not occurred and went ahead with one of the positive things he could do in the meanwhile, which was to coordinate a plan with the Navy for an attack on both rebel fortifications. Despite the fact that the Navy had dumped the operation of the river ironclads into the Army's hands, it did agree to furnish officers to man the ships, as long as Army soldiers served as the crews. In charge of this considerably powerful flotilla was a stern, teetotaling sailor of the old school, Commodore Andrew H. Foote, who had fought from the China Seas to the South Atlantic and was, in fact, the naval officer who had been assigned to purchase Jefferson Davis's camels in Egypt a few years earlier. Foote was a puritanically religious anti-slavery man who held Sunday school classes for his sailors, abolished the ration, ration aboard his vessels, and lobbied for an alcohol-free navy, an endeavor that was ultimately successful. He was also an ardent believer in amphibious warfare, or at best, joint Army-Navy operations. And here was perhaps the most important thing that he had in common with Grant. His positions on drinking, slavery, and religion were ambiguous, to say the least. In any case, Foote enthusiastically embraced Grant's proposal to have Union gunboats escort his troops on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers to the Confederate forts and bombard them while the infantry moved overland to finish off the job. It may have been Foote's strident endorsement of this plan or Halleck's skittishness that his supposed rival Buell was planning a move of his own on the rebel positions in central and eastern Kentucky. But in less than a week after he had dismissed Grant's preposterous notion, Halleck reversed himself and ordered Grant to go forward with the attack at all deliberate speed. Both Grant and Foote had realized that the reduction of Forts Henry and Donelson itself was not a matter of much consequence, but the fruits that would flow from it certainly were. First, by outflanking the strong Confederate bastion at Columbus, Kentucky, the rebels would be forced to either withdraw or surrender, thus opening the Mississippi down to their next important fortification, a bristling little obstruction on the Tennessee-Kentucky line called Island No. 10, which plugged the way to Memphis like a cork in a bottle. Second, and equally as important, by removing the enemy forts on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, the powerful Union gunboats could follow the paths of these two major streams almost at will, blasting Confederate railway bridges into matchsticks, and otherwise disrupting communications in the enemy's rear. The significance of this can hardly be overstated. The Tennessee River not only ran the length of that state, but it bisected the main Confederate railroad connection between Memphis and Virginia, before turning well into the deep South states of Mississippi and Alabama, and then back northward again through Chattanooga and up to its source at Knoxville. Likewise, the Cumberland offered a river highway straight into Nashville, the Confederates' most vital staging and a communication center in the theater, as well as the site of the Confederacy's second largest iron and steel foundry. Thus Grant was already prepared when he received word of Halleck's change of mind on the project, which, perhaps coincidentally, had occurred right after Halleck got word that Buell's army had defeated the Confederates in a battle at Mill Springs, in the southern part of Kentucky about 150 miles to the east, and was also threatening the Confederate Army headquarters at Bowling Green. With Grant's attack on the forts, this would constitute a general Union movement southward all across the Confederates from the Cumberland Gap to the Mississippi, a distance of more than 300 miles, a measure that Grant had been pressing for Halleck to order all along. For its part, the Confederacy knew it was in trouble in the West, but Jefferson Davis had scant troops or armaments to send to his old friend and comrade in arms, Albert Sidney Johnston. When on the eve of the Federal thrust he received an almost frantic message conveyed through one of Johnston's subordinates, he replied, "Oh my, why did General Johnston send you to me for arms and reinforcements, when he must know that I have neither?" So Johnston was on his own. He was an able, impressive-looking officer whom Davis had looked up to at West Point, but his task was almost impossible. First, he was outnumbered by Federal forces by about 2 to 1. Second, many of his soldiers were armed with nothing but shotguns and old flintlocks left over from the War of 1812, and uniforms in many units were often a matter of personal taste. The situation, in fact, illustrated the almost complete unpreparedness of the Confederacy at this stage of the war. When Johnston informed Davis, soon after taking over command in mid September 1861, that he desperately needed rifle for 30,000 men, a cadre of engineers, and other military necessities, the President had his Secretary of War inform the General that the Richmond government could spare but 1,000 rifles, and, further, that the whole available Confederate engineer corps at the time consisted of only 6 captains and 3 majors, of whom one is on burial duty. Johnston did, however, manage to increase his force slightly by cajoling state governments to send him a few militia units, including a regiment of Texas Rangers, to cross the Mississippi River with their horses. By late winter, Johnston had several large Yankee armies bearing down on him all across his line in southern Kentucky, and one place he was desperately worried about was Fort Henry, on the Tennessee. After months of urging the bishop warrior, General Leonidas Polk, to fortify a base there, he was bitterly disappointed to learn that the outpost had been sited on poor ground. First, it was situated below heights from which it could be taken under plunging fire. Worse, it was found that when the river was running high, the place flooded right up to the cannon barrels, and the river now was 14 feet above normal and rising. Worse yet, the fortifications remained uncompleted. "It is most extraordinary," Johnston lamented. "I ordered General Polk 4 months ago to at once construct those works, and now with the enemy on us, nothing of importance has been done." It must have been with apprehension, if not foreboding, that he immediately ordered General Lloyd Tilghman, a West Point graduate and engineer, to rush to the scene and do whatever he could to prepare Fort Henry and its 3,400 men for an assault he was certain was coming. Whether or not Grant knew of these shortcomings, the plan he had worked out to reduce the fort consisted of a flotilla of 4 of Commodore Foote's ironclads, as well as 3 older wooden gunboats, followed by 9 transport steamers carrying over 15,000 infantrymen in 2 waves, 2 full divisions, and a better than 3-to-1 advantage over the Confederates. The troops would embark at Paducah in the late afternoon of February 3, 1862, 50 miles downstream from Fort Henry, and arrive about 8 miles below the fort before dawn on the 4th. Then the big black painted ironclads would move forward in line to test the defenses. Once they established the range, they retired to wait for the transports to go back to Paducah and pick up the remaining division, so that by February 5th, all was in place. The gunboats would move forward and bombard, but the troops disembarked and marched overland to the undefended heights overlooking the works. It might have looked easy, but the Confederates had at least 2 artillery pieces capable of doing great harm to the gunboats, a 6-inch Whitworth rifle, and a huge Columbiad smoothbore that could hurl a 100-plus-pound projectile. Just these 2 did considerable damage as Foote's flotilla steamed nearer and nearer to the fort. The other cannons, though fairly large, were either flooded out by the swollen river that now flowed freely through the fortification itself, or weren't powerful enough to inflict much injury. Foote's flagship was struck 32 times, and the other ironclads fared about the same, but little major damage was done except for the luckless Essex, which had already received a shell in her steering apparatus when she was struck in the boiler, scalding to death many in the engine crew. That, however, was the high tide, as it were, of the Confederate fight, for the Whitworth soon exploded, knocking her crew out of action, and the Columbia, 10 feet long and weighing some 15,000 pounds, was accidentally spiked by a broken primer. By then, the Union ships were blasting away at a point-blank range, while Grant's 15,000 soldiers floundered their way through the marshes in hopes of bagging the whole Confederate force. In this, however, they were disappointed. Tilghman had called to Fort Donelson for reinforcements even before the Federal assault began, but when none were forthcoming, he decided that, rather than lose both the garrison and the fort, he would send away the bulk of his army overland to Fort Donelson, where they could make a stand with the troops there. When it became apparent that further resistance was futile, Tilghman surrendered Fort Henry and was made a prisoner along with his skeleton crew who had manned the guns. Thus victorious, Grant wired Halleck that Fort Henry was in Union hands, and that he was sending his army behind the retreating Confederates while the ironclads returned to the mouth of the Ohio at Paducah. After hasty repairs, they would then steam into the Cumberland for an assault on Fort Donelson. While the ironclads were thus employed, the three wooden gunboats continued on up the Tennessee River, blasting bridges, fortifications, trestles, and Southern steamboats, unlucky enough to get caught in their path. They continued on this 150-mile joyride all the way down through Tennessee, cutting into northern Mississippi and Alabama, destroying as they went and panicking a population that had been assured the dreaded Yankees would never get that far south. Grant's prediction that a move against Fort Henry could cause the Confederates to withdraw from Columbus had proven correct, and the 11,000 rebels who had blockaded the Mississippi River there were soon in full retreat into the Tennessee. Not only that, but coupled with the defeat at Mill Springs and the far eastern part of the state, General Johnston now concluded that his army at Bowling Green was in peril from a renewed thrust by Buell. Accordingly, he ordered them to retreat as well, giving up not only his well-established line across southern Kentucky, but much of Tennessee too, since without reinforcements from the east, he could not protect Nashville and his vital supply base there. With the fall of Fort Donelson, the onus now fell on 56-year-old Confederate Brigadier John B. Floyd, another political general, who had served as U.S. Secretary of War following Jefferson Davis's term in that office. A man with little military experience, Floyd not only had been removed from his command in the Shenandoah Valley at the insistence of Robert E. Lee, who was also under federal indictment in Washington for malfeasance stemming from some shady manipulations with Indian trust bonds belonging to the Department of the Interior. And if that weren't enough, he was also roundly excoriated throughout the North for allegedly using his position as Secretary of War to transfer large numbers of arms and munitions to Southern arsenals on the eve of the conflict. Floyd's second in command was better, but not by much. It was 56-year-old Brigadier General Gideon Pillow, a bombastic Tennessee lawyer who had given a prominent military appointment by his friend and fellow Tennessean President James K. Polk during the Mexican War, in which he was twice wounded. His record was marred, however, by an acrimonious dispute with his commanding general Winfield Scott. Third in command was the 39-year-old Kentucky Brigadier Simon Bolivar Buckner, a West Point classmate of Grant's who had been cited for bravery in the Mexican War. In fact, he was the very one who years earlier had lent money to Grant so that he could get home to St. Louis. Knowing that Fort Donelson could probably not withstand Grant's onslaught, Johnston's charge to Floyd was to at least hold him off long enough until the army at Bowling Green, some 70 miles to the northeast, could be safely evacuated toward Nashville. With this in mind, and with some 17,500 men, including the cavalry, commanded of Nathan Bedford Forrest, already well on his way to living up to his well-earned sobriquet, the Wizard of the Saddle, Floyd determined not only to hold off Grant but to defeat him and save the West. Grant started his army overland on a 12-mile march toward Fort Donelson on February 12th, nearly a week later than planned. By then, his army had grown considerably, owing to reinforcements being rushed into the scene by an elated Halleck, who saw in Grant's success a jewel in his own crown. When all was said and done, Grant could count on about 27,500 men against Floyd's 17,500. But all was not said and done. Harking to Floyd's persistent demands, Johnston had been sending him whatever Confederate reinforcements he could, and Grant would not now enjoy the textbook formula of a 3-to-1 majority recommended for attacking fortified positions. The march from Fort Henry began on a balmy morning, which at the time of year can be deceiving. Anyone familiar with the South in winter knows that the weather is subject to sudden and dramatic changes, and not understanding this as the day wore warmly on, Grant's soldiers began shedding their heavy overgarments and blankets until the roadside was littered with them. The officers, who should have known better, did nothing to stop them. By the time he reached the outskirts of Fort Donelson and his army encountered the first line rebel pickets, Grant sounded out his disposition orders. The division under 60-year-old C.S. Smith, the white-haired former commandant of cadets while Grant was at West Point, was told to peel off north and anchor the Union line on a bend in the river, while the hatchet-faced Illinois politician John McClernand would hold the right on Grant's line to the south, preventing a Confederate escape. Exactly what Grant had been expecting when he reached Fort Donelson is not recorded, but what he found there late that afternoon was a 6-mile-long crescent-shaped line of rebel rifle pits and field artillery, position stretching on both sides of the river bend, with a fort to the north, and the little town of Dover to the south. Grant's plan at the time was to invest the rebel line and wait for Foote's ironclads to arrive and shell the fort into submission, as they had back at Fort Henry. Accordingly, he gave instructions to set up and wait for orders, but it wasn't long before McClernand became embroiled in a fight with a Confederate battery to his front, and was repulsed after several bloody and wasted charges. This should have given Grant pause that McClernand needed close supervision, and he probably ought to have attached himself to the inexperienced general for the duration of the campaign. But instead, Grant rode off to the north end of his line, and found a comfortable farmhouse in which to spend the night. As expected, the next morning, Foote's gunboats began to move on Fort Donelson, but unlike his earlier success, the lone ironclad that was then on the scene, Carondelet, was driven off with significant damage and many casualties, and a simultaneous attack by Smith's division proved futile and costly. Not only that, but as night fell, so did a drizzling rain, which turned into sleet, ice, and snow that covered everything, set the temperature plummeting to 12 degrees, and froze to death a number of Union wounded, causing the others to curse their own stupidity and throwing away their cold weather gear. At this point, Grant decided to wait for Foote's full ironclad fleet, as well as his reinforcements coming by transport steamers and overland from Fort Henry. And so while the icy weather continued the next day, the two sides huddled in their respective lines, content to take pot shots at each other across no man's land. By morning, Grant's reinforcements began to arrive, 2,400 from Fort Henry and 7,500 sent by Halleck from Paducah. The former he assigned to Smith's division, which needed replacements after an abortive assault on the previous day, and the latter he placed under the command of Lewis Lew Wallace, a tall, multi-talented 35-year-old Indiana lawyer who would go on to write Ben-Hur, the whole descender with this full new division. Now Grant felt ready, and, with Foote's ironclads finally in place, he waited for the sound of ships' guns to complete his victory. Instead, he got a rude surprise. The Confederate guns at Donelson were much better situated than those at Henry, and soon Foote's gunboats, which had engaged the fort from nearly a mile away, suddenly went reeling backward down the river with smokestacks shot off, pilot houses blown apart, timber splintered, iron plate dented, and, perhaps worst of all, Foote himself seriously wounded. This unsettled but did not unnerve Grant, and he wired Halleck that the place could probably be taken only by a protracted siege. Accordingly, he told McClernand to crab round to his right, southward, to cut off any Confederate escape route, instructed everyone else to hold their ground, and before dawn on February 15th, went off downriver to meet with a Navy Commodore, who had been shot in the foot. Just after sunrise, Grant may or may not have heard the dim rumble of artillery fire from the far south end of his line, where McClernand's division was posted. But as he rode away from the conference with Foote, he was met by a frantic messenger with the disquieting news that the Confederates were attacking McClernand in force, and had thrown the whole division back in disarray. This was the last thing Grant had expected, having assumed that Pillow and Floyd were merely bumblers who would have surrendered sooner or later. As he neared his Bellegarde positions, Grant was further informed that wounded and dead Confederates were found to be carrying extra rations in their haversacks. Unlike some of his subordinates, who interpreted this as proof that the rebels were planning a prolonged assault, Grant concluded that it was instead a sign that they were trying to escape, and he busied himself trying to rally McClernand's demoralized troops. Grant's intuition had been correct. After the repulse of Foote's ironclad attack, the rebel soldiers were jubilant, and Floyd, who had forecast the worst as the Federal gunboats closed in, had decided to go for a break through the Union lines at the southernmost point, near the village of Dover, which was occupied by McClernand's division. Pillow made the initial assault at dawn the next day, while Buckner brought his division down from the northern sector to cover the flanks as the whole of the garrison made good its escape. Fortuitously for the careworn Southerners, another fierce snowstorm came whipping in from the west, hiding the sights and sounds of the Confederate movement, and as day broke, regiment after regiment of gray-clad infantry charged through McClernand's lines, killing and scattering men and horses and capturing artillery. Bloodstains on the freshly fallen snow proved how hot the fight had become, as Grant rode into the melee about 3 hours on, urging men to refill their cartridge boxes and get back into the fighting. Seeing their commander-in-chief at the front, they did it with a cheer, The one who attacks now would be victorious, Grant declared to whomever would listen, an axiom that he followed, rightly or wrongly, throughout the war. Presently he came upon a traumatized McClernand, who was overheard to mutter, "This army wants ahead." Taken aback by this impolitic remark, Grant replied, "It would seem so," and rode on. The snowy ground all around him was littered with crumbled bodies of the wounded, dead, and dying, Union and Confederate alike. After a while, Grant, repelled by the bloodshed, told his staff, "Let's get out of this dreadful place." Instead of pressing the Yankees harder, Floyd managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory by stopping to assess his situation. After sending a telegram to Johnston, prematurely claiming, "The day is ours," the Confederate general got cold feet, and the usually sanguinary Pillow did the same, while Buckner, known for his cautious, ironically, insisted on pushing forward for a complete breakthrough. Floyd's original orders from Johnston had been to protect the west flank of the Bowling Green Army as it withdrew southward, and this he had accomplished by delaying Grant for more than a week. But the other part of his instructions called for him to get his army safely away from Donelson if holding the fort proved untenable, and this now became the tricky part. Listening to Pellow's and Buckner's increasingly heated argument, Floyd vacillated first one way, then the other, before agreeing with Pellow to return his divisions to their original lines. For all intents and purposes, this ended the Battle of Fort Donelson, except for several curious footnotes. First was the behavior of Floyd and Pellow with respect to the inevitable surrender. Floyd was afraid that his previous indictment by the U.S. government, as well as the charges that he illegally transferred government arms to Southern arsenals while he was Secretary of War, would land him in jail or worse, and Pellow, for his part, had made such a boisterous habit of publicly proclaiming, "Give me liberty or give me death," that he was too chagrined to surrender lest he became a laughingstock. Therefore, the two senior generals passed along the onerous duty of capitulation to their subordinate, Buckner, while they cravenly made their escapes by night to safety across the river. Meantime, there was at least one Confederate officer at Donelson who had no intention of capitulating, and that was Nathan Bedford Forrest, who declared, "I did not come here for the purpose of surrendering my command." But Buckner's acquiescence, Forrest and his cavalrymen waded all night through swamp water, sometimes rump high, on their horses, and by sunup had delivered themselves out of harm's way, taking along a number of infantry soldiers who felt likewise. Finally, it was Buckner's turn to perform his repugnant duty. He sent a letter to Grant alluding to his present state of affairs and asking for the appointment of commissioners to agree upon the terms of capitulation, signing it, "Respectfully, your obedient servant," etc. Awakened from his sleep by the arrival of this message, Grant sent a terse reply to his former friend and benefactor, stating, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I would propose to move immediately upon your works." History has not recorded Buckner's personal reaction when he received this rude answer to his poignantly civil request. After all, it was the first surrender of an entire Confederate army. But if he expected Grant to let his men march out of Fort Donelson as the Confederates had when Fort Sumter capitulated the previous spring, under arms and with the Union flag flying to board their ships for home, he was sorely mistaken. Buckner sent Grant a grumbling response complaining about the ungenerous and unchivalrous terms which he proposed, then hauled down his flag and made himself a Union prisoner. In the North, Grant became a hero almost overnight. When word got out about the unconditional surrender, part of his reply to Buckner, he was heralded in the press as U.S. Unconditional Surrender Grant. Learning from newspaper reports that the general had been seen smoking a cigar during the height of the battle, people sent him cigars by the boxload, and he thus began a habit that would eventually kill him. With Donelson out of the way, Grant was all for pushing on immediately to Nashville, but, inexplicably, Halleck held him up. Nevertheless, in taking Donelson, Grant had swept up an entire enemy army of 12,000 prisoners and inflicted some 2,000 casualties, at a cost of some 3,000 casualties of his own. And the capture of Fort Donelson was trumpeted as the first great victory for the Union. For its part, the Confederacy's entire strategic plan had been set on its ear. From just west of the Cumberland Gap to the Mississippi, the southern defensive front across Kentucky had collapsed, and with the fall of Nashville now imminent, Johnston ordered it evacuated too. At least Nathan Bedford Forrest was there when he was most needed to try and bring order out of the chaos. While panicked mobs threatened to break into Confederate stores and warehouses, Forrest oversaw the loading and disposition of hundreds of wagons filled with munitions, food, and clothing, which were then put on railroad cars and headed toward Atlanta and other southern cities. Likewise, Forrest had his men dismantle entire weapon factories and sent their precious machinery south to be reassembled. For a 40-year-old former slave trader and cotton farmer with no formal military schooling, in fact, little formal schooling at all, Forrest was already becoming a legend in the annals of cavalrymen. He worked his way up from private to general by dint of courage, ingenuity, and raw military horse sense. It has been suggested more than once that if he had held higher command sooner, that say of an army, the war in the West may have had a different outcome. Now that Johnston's Kentucky front had actually caved in, most of Tennessee would have to be abandoned as well, and a new line established across the entire southern part of the state, gateway to the Confederate heartland of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas, stretching more than 300 miles from Chattanooga to Memphis, and with 1/4 fewer troops to defend it, thanks to Grant and the fiasco of Fort Donelson.